I don't know the Velketh language. I want to get that out in the open before anything else, because the Velketh lore keeper made a great deal of ceremony about the fact that I did, in a sense, know it, or that my hands had learned a piece of it without my understanding what the piece was. And I've spent the better part of the last 7 months trying to explain to various officials, translators, and what I'm told are 3 separate lineage scholars that I just copied what was written on the sign. I copied it because I didn't know what else to write. I didn't know I was doing anything unusual. I was a housekeeper at the Velketh diplomatic compound on the frontier station of Harethseld, and I had a paralyzed dragon lying in the east wing, and he was alone most of the day, and it seemed wrong to leave without letting him know someone had been in. That's the whole of it, from my end. The rest, apparently, is history. My name is Davin Sen. I was 61 at the time of these events, though I have since been told by a Velketh court herald that in their reckoning I was 104, which is counted from the year of the first bonding record of one's bloodline, and is, I gather, a significant number. I didn't know my bloodline had a bonding record. I thought my grandmother was a seamstress from the Orvith coastal settlements. The herald seemed to feel these 2 things were not in contradiction. I've decided to take his word for it. I came to Harethseld the way most people come to Harethseld, which is to say I was placed there by a contract agency, which had been placed there by the Frontier Development Consortium, which had been placed there by an arrangement between 3 governments, none of which particularly wanted to be responsible for the maintenance costs of a joint embassy complex at the edge of the Corved Reach. The compound was enormous. It had been built for a diplomatic mission of several hundred staff and 24 dragon envoys, back when that sort of optimism was fashionable. By the time I arrived, the mission staff had reduced to 9 humans and, in the East Wing, 1 dragon. I had not especially sought out the frontier posting. I had taken it because the agency offered it and the pay differential was meaningful, and my previous post, a large medical facility on the Orvith mid-stations, had restructured in the way large medical facilities restructure when the administration changes, which is to say everyone who had been there a long time found their roles quietly reconfigured until they no longer resembled the roles they'd been hired for. I had been a housekeeper for 31 years. I know how to read a room, and I know how to read a building, and I knew that the mid-station facility was a building telling me it was time to go. So I went. A frontier diplomatic compound at the edge of contested reach was not where I had imagined going, but it had clean air, a clear maintenance brief, and a supply situation that was workable if you knew how to manage a delivery schedule. I know how to manage a delivery schedule. I said yes. The compound sat at the junction of 2 cargo transit corridors, which was why it had been built where it was rather than anywhere more convenient. Harethseld Station was primarily a freight operation, bulk carriers, transit workers, a permanent population that ran to about 4,000, and a transient population that doubled that on a busy cycle. The diplomatic compound was its own sealed section, built into the station's outer ring with its own atmosphere management and its own entry points. A small enclosed world of marble composite floors and high ceilings, and the particular silence of a building designed for formal occasions that had stopped having formal occasions some years ago. There were 9 of us on the human staff. The compound director, who was a capable man named Orvast, who had been there 8 years and had the calm, slightly tired manner of someone who has made peace with reduced circumstances. 2 administrative staff who handled the minimal diplomatic correspondence that still came through. A kitchen operative who ran the small staff canteen. A facilities manager who was responsible for the station interface systems and the structural maintenance. And 4 housekeepers, of whom I was the most recently arrived. We each had assigned sections. I was given the East Wing plus 2 secondary corridors and the administrative supply rooms. The East Wing, I was told, was separate from the others. It required a different approach. The departing housekeeper, whose role I was taking, would brief me. She did not brief me in person. She had already left by the time I arrived. Her contract ended. Her section handed over to the incoming replacement with the professionalism of someone who has finished a job and doesn't need to explain it further. What she left was the intake file, the supply checklist, and the note in the supply closet. East Wing occupant, do not enter without first knocking and waiting. And the second line in the darker, smaller ink, he won't answer, but knock anyway. His name was Velkaren. I learned that from the intake file, along with his designation, first-line envoy of the Velketh founding houses, attached to the Hareth-Seld compound for the purpose of the Korth Reach boundary negotiations, which had been ongoing for 11 years and had recently stalled in the way that boundary negotiations stall when both parties have enough to lose. That forward movement feels more dangerous than standing still. He had been injured in a border engagement 8 months prior. The injury was to his cervical spine. The relevant anatomy was Velketh rather than human, but the implication was the same. The nerves that ran from his brain into the great weight of his neck and shoulders had been damaged, and the damage had left him unable to lift his own head, unable to fly, limited in his ability to move his forelegs beyond small shifts of weight and angle. He was not dying, the file was clear on this, but a paralyzed Velketh envoy at a stalled negotiation in a compound that had been running at reduced capacity for 3 years was a situation that had settled into a kind of suspended status, acknowledged, maintained, not resolved. The East Wing was sealed off from the main compound by a pair of glass-reinforced doors that needed a keycard, and beyond them, a second set of plain steel doors that simply required you to push them. The keycard doors were there for temperature regulation. The East Wing ran warmer than the rest of the compound, warm enough that you felt it the moment you stepped through. A close, heavy air that smelled of something mineral and old, like heated stone left out in a dry wind. The steel doors were, I eventually understood, symbolic. The Velketh do not lock a wounded dignitary behind sealed doors. They believe it compounds the dishonor of the wound, so the doors were left unlocked as a gesture of dignity. The doors being there at all was a concession to his need for privacy. The whole arrangement had the feeling of a problem solved by a committee that disagreed on the problem. I knocked anyway, both sets. Velkaren lay on what I can only describe as a low stone platform built against the far wall. Though it was not precisely stone, it was a Velketh resting surface, a latticed construction of mineral composite and layered fabric that distributed weight in ways that were apparently critical for a dragon whose spine had been damaged. He was large. I had been told he was large, but the telling hadn't quite prepared me for the reality of him lying there in the angled morning light from the high compound window. Roughly the size of a large draft horse when lying prone, scaled in deep violet charcoal that caught the light in ridged patterns along his neck and shoulders, wings folded so flat against his back they barely registered as wings until the light shifted and you caught the membrane edge. His tail was long, the tip tapering to a smooth, slightly widened point in the way that told you, if you knew Velketh physiognomy at all, that he was a high-caste founding line member. The tail shape is one of the lineage markers, I learned later, though I did not know this on that first morning. His claws were retracted. His head lay at an angle on a shaped cushion, also Velketh construction, dense and specifically engineered, because he could not lift it on his own. The injury to his spine had taken that from him. He could move his tail. He could shift his front legs a little. He could blink and breathe, and I was told, still speak in the lower registers if he chose to, though he had not chosen to in some weeks. He watched me come in. That was the first thing I noticed. Not that he was frightening, not that he was strange, not that the room was warmer than I expected or smelled older than any room I'd cleaned before. What I noticed was that he watched, not with the flat look of an animal that registers movement as potential threat, with attention, with the particular quality of attention that belongs to a mind that has been very still for a very long time and is noting, precisely, that something in its environment has changed. I knocked again on the door frame, which I admit was redundant at that point. Then I said good morning and told him I was the new compound housekeeper and that I'd be coming in each morning to maintain the wing and that I'd try not to be a nuisance. And if there was anything he needed me to bring or to move, he could. And then I stopped, because I didn't actually know the protocol for communicating with him. The intake file had not addressed this. I said I'd figure it out and left it at that. He made no sound. But he was still watching me when I left. The East Wing maintenance was not extensive. Velkaren's platform and personal effects were not mine to touch. A Velketh attendant came every third day from the main compound staff for those, and the room itself was large and largely empty. The high window needed no cleaning from inside. The floor was the old compound tile, dark and practical, with the faint scoring of many years of diplomatic traffic. A detail that I found, for no reason I could articulate, quietly moving the way evidence of a room's long use is always moving. I swept it, checked that the air circulation system was running, replaced the water in the large basin they kept in the southeast corner, and noted what supplies were running low. That took perhaps 40 minutes. Then I knocked on the door frame again going out. I had decided this was simply what I did, and said I'd be back tomorrow morning, and left. The water basin was important. It was not a basin in the human sense. It was more like a low trough built into the floor, fed by a slow supply line from the compound's water management system, and holding perhaps 80 liters at a time. Velketh of founding line rank have specific hydration requirements related to their respiratory thermal regulation, and the maintenance of the basin, keeping it full, keeping the supply line clear, checking the water temperature, was listed in my intake file as a critical daily task. I took it seriously. I had been a housekeeper for 31 years, and I had learned that the maintenance tasks listed as critical in intake files are almost always critical for reasons the intake file doesn't bother to explain, because the person who wrote the intake file knew the reasons and thought they were obvious. I did the basin every morning, fresh water, clear line, correct temperature. I noted the level and the temperature in the logbook on the shelf beside the door, the broad-paged, linen-covered logbook used for East Wing maintenance records, and moved on. 3 weeks. That's how long I kept the routine before the note. It wasn't that 3 weeks was a particularly charged period. Nothing dramatic happened. I came in, I did the work. I said good morning going in, and I'll be Monaro going out. And Velkaren lay on his platform and watched me and made no sound. The Velketh attendant came every third day. The compound director checked in with me once a week in the brief. Efficient way of a director managing a situation he can't fully address and has decided to monitor steadily instead. The other housekeeping staff were pleasant and professional. The work was clean and regular, the kind of work I find satisfying in a plain way. But I kept thinking about the quality of Velkaren's silence. There are different silences in a room. There is the silence of a room in use, where someone is working, resting in their own thoughts, not requiring anything from the air around them but their own occupation of it. There is the silence of a room between people, a social silence that has its own texture, depending on whether the people in it are comfortable with each other or not. And there is the silence of a room where someone is waiting, not for a specific thing, but in the more general sense of waiting that happens when the particular future you expected is no longer available, and you have not yet located. Another one, Velkaren's silence, by the end of the first week, had begun to seem to me like the third kind. The specific quality of it, the attention that never quite settled, the watchfulness that stayed alert without ever finding anything to be alert about, read to my 31 years of reading rooms, as a mind that had set down its ordinary occupation and was holding the space where it used to be. I had seen this before in medical facilities, in long-term patients who had been injured or ill past the point where recovery was the obvious next chapter, in elderly residents of care facilities who had outlasted their context, in the particular stillness of people who have been told, in one way or another, that the important part is over, and who have not decided whether to believe this yet. I didn't know what to do about it. It wasn't my job to do anything about it in the official sense. My job was the basin, the floor, the circulation, the supplies. I did those things thoroughly and on time and without complaint, because that is what the job is. And doing the job matters regardless of whether anyone is watching or measuring. But the silence was there, and it had weight. The sign was the reason I started writing in Velketh, or in what I thought was Velketh. It was an old compound sign, mounted on the wall beside the water basin, laminated and slightly warped with age. The lamination had lifted at one corner, and a faint watermark ran diagonally through the lower portion, evidence of an old humidity event. It was a posting from the original diplomatic mission, listing maintenance protocols for the East Wing's shared areas. It was written first in Velketh script, and then in a phonetic transliteration below. Each line, the way things were done in the early days of the compound when the human staff spoke no. Velketh at all and the Velketh envoys spoke no. Frontier standard, and everything ran on transliterations and patience. I had read the sign probably 50 times over those 3 weeks before I actually read it. You know how that goes. It's there, you see it, you don't look at it. Then one morning I was waiting for the water basin to fill. The supply line was running slightly slow, a pressure issue I'd flagged 3 days prior that the facilities manager hadn't gotten to yet. And I read it properly for the first time, working through the phonetics line by line, the maintenance schedules, the supply rotation, the request protocol for non-standard supply items, a note about circulation thresholds in winter cycles, ordinary administrative language, the kind of thing posted on the walls of maintenance areas everywhere, written by people who thought the information would be needed regularly, and discovered later that no one reads wall signs after the first month. And at the bottom, a single line in a slightly different typeface, smaller, slightly offset as though added to the original posting as an afterthought, or by a different hand, or at a different time from the rest. I sounded it out slowly, running my finger under the phonetic guide. Velkaran Sathan Duvath, Telsen Kor. There was no translation below that line. I didn't know why. I assumed it was something administrative. A reference code for the specific wing, perhaps, or a maintenance note in Velketh that hadn't been translated when the rest were. These things happen. A large compound built quickly uses different staff for different sections, and the translation quality varies, and items get missed. I turned to the logbook and copied it under the day's maintenance entry, along with a note to ask the compound director if he knew what the line meant. I asked him that afternoon. He said he didn't know and would look into it. I noted in the logbook that the question was pending and went on with my day. He never got back to me on it. That's not a criticism of the man. He was managing a compound with 9 staff and an ongoing diplomatic non-situation, and a budget that required quarterly justification to 3 separate government offices, and a marginal annotation on a wall sign in a language no one on the current staff read was a genuinely low-priority question. I understood this. I let it sit. But the next morning I came in, knocked on both doors, said good morning, did the maintenance. And when I came to write the day's record in the logbook, I found that I had written the phrase again. And again I had no translation. I had just written it. I am not sure I could have told you at that moment why it felt like the right thing to put on that page, except that it had the feel of something meant to be said in that room. A specific, purposeful sound, not an administrative note, not a code. It had the feel of language used between people, of the kind of thing you say when you want someone to know you were present. I wrote it under the maintenance notes the way you might write a person's name at the top of a page intended for them, a salutation, a marking of address. The third morning I wrote it in the logbook, and then without quite planning to, said it aloud as I was going out the door. Velkaran Sathan Duvath, Telsen Kor. I mispronounced it almost certainly. My knowledge of Velketh was a compound maintenance sign from 20 years prior, and 40 minutes of phonetic guessing over 3 mornings. I said it the way you say something in a language you've read but never heard spoken, carefully, self-consciously, aware that what you're producing is an approximation of the thing at best. Velkaren's tail moved, not much, a slow shift, the tip curling slightly inward and then releasing, then nothing. I said good morning again, for completeness, and left. I want to be clear that I did not at this point imagine I had done anything significant. A paralyzed dragon's tail had moved. Tails move. He moved his tail sometimes when the attendant came, sometimes when the air circulation cycling changed and the room temperature shifted briefly. I noted it in the logbook. Tail movement, possible response to vocalization, unclear, and moved on with my day, which involved 7 other rooms, 2 broken supply units in the north corridor, and an argument with the building maintenance system about whether the East Wing's thermal variance counted as a scheduled or an emergency adjustment. It counted as scheduled, but the system disagreed, and the system had to be persuaded, which took 45 minutes and the facilities manager's override code. I kept writing the phrase in the logbook. I kept saying it going out the door in the mornings. It became part of the routine, the same way knocking on the door frame had become part of the routine. A thing I did not because I thought it accomplished something specific, but because it seemed like the right shape of the morning. A room should be entered with a knock and left with a word. That was my view. I had probably never articulated it before, but it was my view. The tail movement became more consistent by the second week. Not dramatic, not a sweep or a lash, nothing that would read as excited or alarmed. The same slow curl, the same deliberate tip flex, with the quality of something intentional rather than reflexive. I noted it each time. Week 3, he began to watch the door in the final minutes of my stay, which I noticed because I happened to look up from the logbook and found him tracking me at the door frame as I was gathering my caddy to leave, his eyes following my movement in a way that was not, I thought, the same attention as when I arrived. Arriving, he watched me the way he watched everything, noting, cataloging, keeping record. Going, he watched me differently. Going, there was something in the watching that was about the going itself, not about me in the abstract. I thought about this on the walk back to the supply corridor. Then I decided that I was reading an injured dragon's tail movements and eye tracking with a level of interpretive confidence that my actual knowledge of Velketh physiology did not support. I had been a housekeeper for 31 years, not a veterinary specialist. I made a note in the logbook and got on with the day. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing because the sign had no translation for that line and the compound had no active Velketh language. Staff in the intake file contained nothing remotely useful, was what the phrase meant. I didn't find out until the lore keeper came. That was 2 months and 11 days after I started. I know the number precisely because I counted it back afterward, with a cold and slightly unsteady interest in the arithmetic of what had happened to me. The lore keeper arrived with the quarterly diplomatic review delegation, 3 Velketh officials in the administrative cast colors of deep teal and burnished copper, accompanied by a human interpreter and 2 junior diplomatic staff who appeared to be there primarily to hold things. The delegation's purpose was formally listed as inspection of the compound's ongoing maintenance and operational readiness, and informally, I gathered from the compound director's expression over the preceding week as an assessment of whether Velkaren's continued presence at Harith Seld was diplomatically sustainable, or whether he should be transferred to a full Velketh medical facility in one of the core Reach systems. The assessment was a formality. Everyone involved knew that a Velketh envoy of his rank transferred to a medical facility was an envoy who would not return to the diplomatic service. The question was how to conduct the formality with the appropriate amount of face preserved on all sides. I was not involved in any of this. I learned it afterward. On the morning of the delegation's compound inspection, I simply did my job, which on that morning meant the East Wing as usual. First thing, because I always did the East Wing first. I knocked on both doors, said good morning, did the basin, did the floor, checked the air circulation, replaced a supply item in the corridor alcove. And then I wrote the day's logbook entry and said the phrase going out. Velkarin Sathan Duvath, Tel Sen Kor, and the lore keeper was in the corridor. I did not know she was the lore keeper. I knew she was Velketh, the administrative caste colors, the bearing that all Velketh of high rank carry like a second skin, the eyes that were taking in the corridor and me and the door and the logbook, under my arm with the particular quality of focus that I later came to understand was characteristic of her specifically. She had the quality of a person who reads everything, not a scanning quality, not the rapid data intake of someone moving efficiently through an environment, but the considered attention of someone who understands that every legible thing contains something and that most legible things are underread. I said good morning. She did not respond immediately. She was looking at the logbook. I held it out, on instinct. The same instinct that makes you show your work to someone who seems to be looking for it. Here, this is what I have. She took it. She held it in both hands. She had 4 fingers and a thumb, scaled from the knuckle up in the administrative cast copper, with the specific texture of old scales that have been maintained for a very long time. Not smoothed, not polished, but attended to. The way well-kept things accumulate a quality that is different from either newness or neglect. She turned the pages with the careful movement of someone handling something that might matter. When she reached the first page where I had written the phrase, she went very still. Not the stillness of someone who has stopped, the stillness of someone who has arrived. She read forward from that page. There were 67 entries by then, 1 for each morning I had written it, the date, the maintenance notes, and the phrase, in my handwriting, which is plain and regular and slightly crowded. The handwriting of someone who was taught to write by a teacher who believed in consistency above elegance. She read all 67. It took perhaps 8 minutes. I stood in the corridor and held my cleaning supply caddy and watched her read, because there was nothing else particularly useful I could do, and because leaving felt wrong. She closed the logbook. She looked at me. I don't have Velketh for this, she said, in the frontier standard of the delegation's interpreter, who had materialized at her elbow at some point without my noticing she was not addressing the interpreter. She was addressing me. I don't have Velketh for this, because it is not in the register I know. It is not in any register I have read. It is older than the registers I know. She turned back 1 page in the logbook and held it so I could see my handwriting. Where did you learn this phrase? I told her about the sign. I walked her back to the basin and showed her. She read the sign for a long time, longer than I had ever read it, standing very close to it, her eyes moving in a pattern that was not left to right, but something more intricate, a reading method I didn't recognize. Then she read the last line again, the one in the slightly different typeface, the one without a translation. She said something under her breath in Velketh that the interpreter did not translate. Then she turned to look at the door to Velkarin's resting room. I should explain, she said, and she said it in the tone of someone who has just understood that an explanation is going to require some time. The phrase, the one you have been writing and speaking, it is very old. It is from the early bonding period of the Velketh founding lineages, before the administrative standardization, when the human wards of a Velketh household marked their day presence with a specific ritual utterance. The phrase says, Velkarin, I use the name as it appears in your logbook, which is correct, remains in my keeping. I was here this morning, and I will come again. You are held. I looked at my logbook in her hands. You have been writing this every morning for 67 mornings, she said, and speaking it aloud. I said I had. I said I hadn't known what it meant. I said I had only copied it because there was no translation. Yes, she said, there would have been no translation. This phrase was removed from the standard translation records at the close of the bonding period, 412 years ago, when the human wards of the Velketh houses were formally released from their bonding obligations. The phrase passed out of use. It exists now only in archival records. She looked at the sign on the wall And in this compound, apparently, she paused. I do not know how it came to be on this sign. That is a question for the archivists. But the fact of its being here is, she paused again, and I noticed that her stillness had the quality of something settling rather than something stopping. Significant. I asked her how significant. She considered this in the way that very precise people consider questions that resist precision. Then she said, the bonding rite, when spoken each day by the ward to the bonded, created a formal record of care. Not a legal record, in your understanding. A lineage record. Each utterance was counted. At a certain number of counts, traditionally 60, though the threshold varied by lineage, the bond was considered established and the ward was named. The naming carried specific responsibilities and specific privileges. It was taken very seriously. She looked at the logbook again. 67, you said. Yes, I said. Yesterday morning was the 67th. She said nothing for a moment. Then, I will need to speak with Velkaren. She went in. The interpreter stayed in the corridor. The junior diplomatic staff stepped back to a respectful distance, with the slight over-careful posture of people who understand that something is happening and are being very professional about not appearing to understand how much. I waited. I don't know how long. Long enough that the interpreter found a stretch of wall to lean against and the junior staff had a quiet discussion about something. And the delegation's other officials passed through twice on their own inspections and gave me the look that officials give maintenance staff who are standing in corridors for no apparent reason. I kept my supply caddy. It seemed important to have something to hold. I thought about 31 years of mornings, about the particular arithmetic of a job that you do every day without particular drama, not because every day is the same, but because every day is what the job requires, and the job requires showing up. I thought about the medical facility on the Orvith mid-stations, where I had worked for 11 years, and where the rooms had been large and the work had been the same work it is everywhere. Floor, basin supply, check, note, out. And where the patients, on good days, had sometimes noticed you were there, and that had been enough. I thought about the note the departing housekeeper had left. Knock anyway. She had known something about this room. She had known it and left the knowledge in 2 short sentences and trusted that whoever came next would read it correctly. When the lore keeper came out, she was different. Not visibly different. The bearing was the same. The administrative caste colors sat on her the same way they had going in. But there was something in the quality of her attention that had shifted in the way a room shifts when a decision has been made in it. She looked at me for a moment before she spoke. He asked that you come in, she said. I went in. Velkaren's head was still on the cushion. The angle was the same, the supported tilt of it, the way the weight of him distributed across the shaped surface. His wings were still flat against his back. He hadn't moved, visibly, from where he'd been when I'd left that morning. But he was looking at me in a way I don't have a clean word for, with a weight and a specificity that made the room feel smaller. The way a room feels smaller when a conversation is actually happening in it rather than around it. I said good morning again. Then I realized I had already said good morning that morning, and that it was now midday, so I said good afternoon. His tail moved, the slow shift, the curl at the tip. Then, with an effort that was visible in the way real effort is always visible, in the slight tremble of the undertaking, the quality of concentration that is fundamentally bodily, that lives in the breath and the jaw and the deliberate steadying of something that is not entirely steady. He spoke, his voice was low. The lore keeper, who had followed me in, had said he could still reach the lower registers, and this was true. His voice lived in the register where you feel it before you hear it, where the sound has weight as well as pitch. He spoke 2 words. I didn't recognize them as words at first. I thought it was a sound he was making, involuntary, the kind of breath sound that large, injured things sometimes make. But then the lore keeper made a very small noise behind me. Not a gasp, exactly, but something involuntary, something that came from a place not entirely under her control. and I understood that it was language. She was quiet for a moment, then she said very carefully, "Spoke your name. The Velketh form of your name, the ward form," he said. "Senketh. The Keth suffix is the marker of a named ward of the Velketh house." She paused. "It is not a title that is usually," she paused again. "He has the right to grant it. As a first-line envoy of the founding lineage, he has the right." She was speaking carefully, in the manner of someone who is being precise, because they know that precision is going to matter here, in the record, when this is recounted later. But the name has not been spoken in the ward form in 400 years. I looked at Velkaren. He was watching me. The tale was still. The effort of the speaking had settled back into him the way effort settles, leaving a quietness that is different from the quietness before. I said, and I want to be honest that I had no idea what to say, and that what came out was probably not the correct thing diplomatically, but it was what I had. I said, "I'll be back tomorrow morning." His tail moved again. The lore keeper made the same small involuntary sound. I went back out to the corridor, picked up my supply caddy, and went to do the north corridor. What happened after that happened to me somewhat the way weather happens. In the sense that I knew it was occurring, I could see the evidence of it, but the mechanisms were largely above my sight line, and the outcome was not something I was directing. The delegation's inspection concluded. The lore keeper sent a report back to the Velketh Administrative Council. That report, I was later told, contained a 23-page addendum detailing the linguistic and lineage implications of 67 consecutive Rite utterances over the primary bonding threshold made to a first-line founding lineage envoy, and the subsequent granting of a ward name, and certain archival findings about the phrase's survival in the compound sign, which apparently connected to a much earlier diplomatic mission, and a bonding bond that had not been properly resolved at the close of the bonding period and had consequently sat open in the lineage record for 400 years, like a contract that had been drafted and signed, and then misfiled. I did not read the 23-page addendum. It was in Velketh. What I knew was what I could observe, which was this. The delegation stayed 4 extra days. Additional Velketh officials arrived from the nearest consular station. Not the administrative caste, a different caste entirely, in deeper colors, moving with a different quality of precision that I eventually identified from watching them, as the precision of people whose work is the preservation of things rather than the administration of them. Archivists, scholars, people whose job is to know what things mean and to ensure that the meaning is kept correctly. They moved through the East Wing with the deliberate care of people in a room they consider significant. The compound director communicated with me in the tight, careful tone of someone who has received information they do not fully understand and is being very professional about it. He told me that the diplomatic review had been extended and that my East Wing routine should continue unchanged. I said all right. He looked like he wanted to say something else but couldn't locate the appropriate register for it. So he said good work instead, and I said thank you, and we went on. The Velketh attendant who came to Velkaren's wing continued to come, but the protocol phrasing stopped, replaced by something longer and different in register, spoken at a volume I could sometimes hear from the corridor, though I could not understand it. The attendant's posture when I saw them in the corridor had changed too. They still nodded to me in the professional acknowledgement of shared facility staff, but there was a quality to the nod that was new. Every morning I came in, knocked on both doors, said good morning, did the basin and the floor and the air circulation, wrote in the logbook, and said the phrase going out. Velkaren Sathanduvath, tel Senkor. He was held. I had been here this morning. I would come again. His tail moved every time, by the 2nd week after the lore keeper's visit. By the 4th week, on a morning when the compound was quiet and the light through the high window had the particular quality of the early hours when even the station's mechanical sounds are subdued and the air has not yet collected the day's business, he spoke again. 2 words, the same as before, Senketh. And then, beneath those 2 words, a third, which the lore keeper, who had remained at the compound, which I later understood was itself an event of considerable administrative significance, translated for me that evening as morning. He was saying good morning. I didn't tell this to the lore keeper immediately. I went and did the north corridor and the administrative wing and the service alcoves. I told her in the evening because I happened to see her on the way to the supply room, and she asked how the east wing was, and I said fine. He said good morning. She was quiet for a moment. Then she wrote something in the small bound record she carried, with the focused attention of someone noting something they need to be certain is noted correctly. The other compound staff had questions. Of course they did. I would have had questions. The two administrative staff were professionally discreet about it, but I caught the looks in the canteen, the particular quality of a group of people who have been told something they're still processing and are too professional to raise directly. Orvas, the compound director, had briefed them at some level, clearly. They knew something significant had occurred in the East Wing, and they knew I was at the center of it. And they were all politely and genuinely curious, and none of them quite asked. The kitchen operative asked, eventually. Her name was Sarah, and she had been at Herath Seld for 4 years, and she had the direct quality of someone who has decided that the frontier posting justifies a certain frankness. She brought me a cup of tea in the supply room on the 4th day of the delegation's extended stay and said, "Is it true you've been leaving notes for the dragon in the East Wing?" I said I had been writing in the logbook, yes, and saying a phrase going out each morning, and that I hadn't known what the phrase meant. She said, "What does it mean?" I told her. "You are held. I was here this morning. I will come again." She was quiet for a moment, holding her own teacup. Then she said, "That's a good thing to say to someone." "Yes," I said. "I think it probably is." She nodded and went back to the canteen. I finished my tea. The supply room was quiet. The station's ventilation ran its low, steady note, the sound of a large enclosed space breathing through its mechanical systems. I thought about the phrase again. Now that I knew what it was, the way it felt different to say it knowing what it said. Not better or worse, but weighted differently, the way a familiar road changes when you learn the name of where it goes. I had said it not knowing what it meant, and I would say it the same way tomorrow. That was the point of a routine. It is what it is before and after the understanding arrives. By the end of the 2nd month after the lore keeper's arrival, he could say 6 words. Not comfortably, not without the visible weight of effort, but he could say them, and he said them to me in the mornings, and I said them back, badly, in the phonetic approximation of someone who is learning a language 40 minutes at a time in a warm room with a mineral smell. The lore keeper had given me a small printed card with the pronunciation guides and a few key phrases. I worked through them in my room in the evenings, saying the sounds to the wall, feeling the approximate shape of them in my mouth and adjusting. What was happening medically was something the Velketh specialists discussed among themselves in terms I didn't have access to. I know only what I observed. He was sleeping differently. The quality of it had changed. There is a difference between the sleep of an injured creature that has given up expecting anything and the sleep of one that has something to wake for, and the difference is visible if you have cleaned enough rooms. He was eating more consistently. The supply records showed it. I kept supply records, and the nutritional supplement consumption in the East Wing had increased it by a measurable percentage over the 6 weeks following the lore keeper's visit. Gone very slightly to show the early movements of weight shift, the shoulder, the neck, the effort of a body that is tentatively testing what it still has, checking the inventory of a self that has been still for a long time. I noticed, around the 6th week, that he had begun watching the door before I arrived. Not at the door specifically, he couldn't see through it, but oriented toward it. The attendant mentioned it once, in passing, in the corridor. He has been facing east in the mornings. I said I came in from the east corridor. Yes. The attendant was quiet for a moment and then said, in the neutral tone of someone filing a professional observation, "He has not done that before. Before your routine began, he faced the window. They said nothing further and went back to the wing. I went to the supply room and noted the observation in my own record. It seemed like the kind of thing to note. The lore keepers spent the evenings in the compound library with the archivists who had arrived from the consular station, going through the older records in the digital archive. Things from the compound's original mission period, scanned documents and logs, and administrative communications from the early decades when the compound had run at full capacity and the Velketh mission had been active and consequential. I saw her there twice, late in the evening, through the library's glass door. Her and one of the archivists, the scaled copper of their cast colors, warm under the library lights, working through something line by line with the specific patience of people doing the work of historical recovery, which is slow work and careful work and important work that very rarely looks like anything dramatic from the outside. She told me, one morning in the corridor, that they had found several additional uses of the phrase in the original mission records, in maintenance logs, in staff communications, in what appeared to be a personal account written by one of the human staff from the compound's second decade of operation. She said they were all written by housekeepers, everyone. She said this in the tone of someone who finds this surprising and meaningful and is still deciding exactly how surprising and meaningful it is, I said. We come in every morning. We say good morning and mean it. It's the job. She considered this for a moment. Then she wrote in her record, whether these changes were the result of the specific acoustic properties of the ward, Rite phrase, or of regular vocalization and expectation, or of something the Velketh specialists were doing that I didn't know about, or simply of having a consistent presence in the room that treated him as a person rather than a situation. I don't know. I am not a medic or a linguist or a lineage scholar. I am a housekeeper. I made sure the room was clean and the water was fresh and someone said good morning and meant it. The naming ceremony, when it came, was not something I had anticipated or prepared for. I was told the evening before by the compound director, who sat me down in the administrative office with the careful formality of someone delivering information they would like to deliver correctly. He said the Velketh Council had ratified the lore keeper's report, and that the founding lineage designation of Senketh was being formally recorded in the lineage archive, and that there would be a ceremony the following morning at which the formal record would be established in my presence as required by the Rite, and that representatives of the council and of the first-line founding houses would attend. He said this in the careful tone of someone who has just told a subordinate that their ordinary morning is going to be somewhat different tomorrow. I asked how different, he said. There will be approximately 40 Velketh present, including the head of the founding council. I said I'd better press my uniform. He looked at me as though uncertain whether I was being dry about it or whether I was genuinely unfazed. I was genuinely unfazed, mostly. I had been a housekeeper for 31 years. Rooms fill with people and empty again. The work is what it is before and after. The ceremony was in the East Wing. They came in the morning, the way things in that compound always seemed to happen. In the clear early light before the station's main traffic cycle, when the corridors were still quiet and the air had not yet collected the day's sounds. They filled the East Wing, which I had not previously imagined could hold 40 Velketh of various castes and functions. But they arranged themselves along the walls and in the corridor beyond the open door with the precise spatial awareness of beings who have been attending formal occasions in structured spaces for a very long time and know how to stand in a room without the room losing its essential character. The lore keeper was at the front, in the position of someone who has organized this and knows exactly what is going to happen. Beside her, in colors I had not seen before, a deep settled blue-black that caught the morning light in the way things catch light when they have mass and history, not just surface, was a dragon I understood to be the head of the founding council. She was older than Velkaren, older than any of the others present, and she was looking at me with the kind of attention that is not assessment. Assessment is forward-looking. It is still deciding. This was already decided. It was recognition. I had my cleaning supply caddy. I had debated leaving it outside, but concluded that bringing it was correct. It was, after all, what I brought every morning. I knocked on the door frame, said good morning, went to the basin and checked the water level, because the basin needed checking, and no amount of ceremonial significance was going to change the water level. I did the floor, quickly but properly. I checked the air circulation. I noted the supply levels. I wrote the day's entry in the logbook, date, maintenance notes, and the phrase, the 93rd time in total if you counted both logbooks. And I closed the logbook and held it. The room was very quiet. 40 Velketh and 1 head of founding council and the lore keeper and 2 human staff from the compound and the compound director, all completely still, watching me check the water level and run the circulation system and note the supply levels in the logbook. I have been watched in rooms before, many times, in many configurations. This was different, not in a way that unsettled me, but in a way that settled things, like pressure applied to something that has been slightly out of place for a long time. Then I went to the door, and I turned at the doorframe, and I said it. Velkaren Sathan Duvath, Tel Sen Kor. The room did something that I don't have a word for. It was not sound. It was a quality of attention reaching a point, the way a chord resolves, or the way light changes when the source of it arrives. A collective presence acknowledging that a thing had happened, was happening, and would be remembered. Karen lifted his head, not fully, not upright, not in the way he might have before the injury. The recovery was real, but it was gradual, and this was not a moment of miraculous restoration. It was a moment of something harder and more earned than that. But up, enough. Enough that his eyes were level with mine from across the room, and he was looking at me not from under himself, but across the space between us, the way one looks at someone they intend to address. He held it for the count of perhaps 5 seconds. Then the weight became too much, and the head settled back to the cushion, slowly, with the particular care of a body managing what it has. But the 5 seconds were there. They had happened. Several of the Velketh along the walls made small sounds. Not speech as something beneath speech, the sound of a threshold crossed. He spoke clearly, in the lower register that fills a room. He spoke for some time. I didn't understand any of it except Senketh, which came at the end, and which I had learned by now to hear cleanly, the lore keeper translated. Her voice was steady and measured, the voice of someone translating carefully to preserve both meaning and weight, because meaning and weight are not always the same thing, and the best translation holds both. He names you his ward keeper. He names you the one who counted the mornings. He says that he heard you come in. He says that he knew 67 mornings ago that you were not going to stop. He says that the knowing of it was the first thing in 8 months that belonged to him and not to his injury. He says, Senketh, the head of the founding council's voice was deeper than Velkaren's, not louder, but more fundamental. The voice of something very old that has learned to say what it means without excess. She spoke briefly. The lore keeper translated. The record is established. The bond is held. The name stands in the founding archive. The room did the thing again, the chord-resolving thing, the collective presence acknowledging. 40 Velketh in the slight formal shift that functions, I was told later, as the equivalent of a spoken affirmation, a whole-body acknowledgement, a held breath released, not kneeling, not bowing in the theatrical sense, just present and accounted for, and clear about what had been witnessed. I said thank you. Then I said, in Velketh that was still approximate, but better than it had been, I'll be back tomorrow morning. The head of the founding council made a sound. I am told it was laughter. I believe it. It had the quality of something genuine and unhurried, something that had been waiting for the right thing to come along and had found it at last and was pleased. I went to do the North Corridor. That was 7 months ago. I am still at Harathseld. The East Wing has 2 Velketh linguistic staff now, and a proper medical consultant who comes twice weekly, and a physical rehabilitation regime for Valkarin that involves, among other things, him pushing against specific resistance supports with his neck and shoulders for measured periods each day, which he does with the focused patience of someone who has remembered what effort is for, and who has somewhere to direct it now. He can hold his head up for 15 minutes at a time now. The lore keeper has informed me this is a rate of progress that the Velketh specialists are being very careful about with each other, in the way that professionals are careful when they don't want to say something that will later have to be walked back. I have been a professional long enough to know that careful professional hedging of this kind usually means things are going well. I still come in first thing every morning. I still knock on both doors. I still say good morning, do the basin, do the floor, do the air circulation, write in the logbook. I still say the phrase going out. He still says good morning back. It's better now, 3 words. Clean, the morning specific greeting rather than just my name, spoken with less visible effort than 6 months ago. He has added a 4th word in the last 2 weeks, which the lore keeper has told me is a Velketh expression of continuity. The sense of a thing persisting as it should. I'm still working on my pronunciation. The lore keeper made me another card. My Velketh is improving in the slow, effortful way of a language learned late, which is to say it is improving, and that is enough. There is a great deal of administrative work attached to the formal designation of Senketh, which the Velketh Council has been thorough about, and which involves documentation I have signed in 3 places and will, at some point, need to be present for in a more formal capacity. I've been told there are responsibilities attendant on the designation that I'll be briefed on. When the lineage scholars have finished determining which aspects of the 400-year-old ward protocol are still applicable and which are not. The scholars, I gather, are thorough people. The process may take some time. That's all right. I'm not going anywhere. The thing about this job, any version of this job, any room you're responsible for, any space you're assigned to maintain, is that what you're really doing, underneath the basin checks and the floor work and the supply rotations, is making sure the room says to whoever is in it, you were here, and you mattered, and someone came. That's the job. The rest is the shape the job takes on a given day. I knock on the door frame. I say good morning. Velkarin says good morning back. That's the whole of it from my end. The rest is what it turned out to be. I go on to the north corridor. On the way, I stop at the old maintenance sign by the water basin, the same as I've done for 7 months now. I read the bottom line. The archivist who came last month said she knows now where the phrase came from. There was a ward named in the founding period who served the East Lineage House and whose record was marked complete, but whose bond was never formally closed because she died before the ceremony could be held. A bonding that was fully real and fully kept right up to the last morning, and then left open in the archive because there was no one left to close it. Someone, a long time later, had put the phrase on the sign. A specific someone, the archivist said. She found the maintenance record, a housekeeper's log from the 2nd decade of the compound's use, noting the addition of a line to the East Wing protocol sign, signed in handwriting that matched no other record in the compound's staff files. Nobody who should have been there. Somebody who understood that the open end of a thing should not simply disappear, that it should be legible, that it should wait. I don't know if the archivist is right about all of it. I don't know enough about the Velketh founding period or the archival methodology to say, but it seems like the right kind of thing to be true. The phrase waits on the sign. I go on to the north corridor. I'll be back tomorrow.